When we read it on a book, history seems linear, easy. A story that goes from point A to point B. Things happen, people are born, they do things, they die. But in truth, history is made of stories written by people, sources. We enjoy a sense of safety by calling these sources historians themselves often, but, well, they are never truly historians. They never truly just want to tell a story, they always have a reason to write. This is why today we're gonna go over our major sources for Roman history. The people that were writing in each era, why we should trust them and why we shouldn't. To speak of the sources of Roman history is already to enter a landscape shaped by survival, selection, and centuries of retelling. The story of Rome comes to us not in a clean, linear archive, but in layers, some preserved by chance, others by ideological preference. When a historian today refers to our evidence, what they are actually holding is a mosaic built from literary narratives, inscriptions, coins, papyrus, archaeological remains, and later summaries of works that no longer exist. But in Roman history, more than in many other ancient fields, it is the writers of the times that dominate the field. Not because it's necessarily the most reliable, but because it is the most rhetorically powerful. The language of Livy, the precision of Polybius, the moral judgments of Tacitus, they become the architecture through which we imagine a whole era. Even when archaeology and comparative evidence warns us the picture is incomplete. Roman history presents a particular difficulty. Most of the narratives were written after the events they describe, sometimes centuries later. A writer like Livy, in the age of Augustus, gives us the fullest account of the kings and early republic, eras far older than any living memory available to him. Tacitus, writing in the 2nd century AD, retroactively interprets the Julio-Claudian emperors through the griefs and hopes of the senatorial class under Domitian and Trajan. Even Cassius Dio, one of the most important historians of the imperial Rome, composes his vast history in Greek more than 200 years after Augustus, reshaping earlier narratives through his own political experiences as a senator under Commodus and Severus. And yet, despite these distortions, Roman history is not simply a house built on sand, where literature leaves us hanging. Epigraphic evidence, the inscriptions carved in stone across the empire, offers the clearest window into administrative reality. The res gestae of Augustus, the milestones that measure the imperial roads, the funerary epitaphs of soldiers and freedmen, the building dedications of provincial communities, all provide hard data that writers sometimes ignore, sometimes contradict, sometimes quietly depend on. Coins, too, act as state-sponsored messaging system, spreading across the empire images of emperors, victories, and divine claims, all datable with a precision that books can never compare to. Archaeology supplies the material environment that writers rarely describe: the growth of cities, the shifting of trade routes, the scars of conflicts on frontier provinces. Of course, archaeological evidence has its own set of problems. They give facts, yes, but not justification, no story. All of this to say, Roman history is a beautiful, beautiful mess, and we are going to try and fix it just a little bit by knowing our sources, just a tad more. So let us begin with our first era, the kings of Rome. The earliest period of Roman history survives not as a chronicle, but as an echo, an era whose outlines are preserved through layers of storytelling. No archival bureaucracy recorded the deeds of Romulus or Servius Tullius. No contemporary poem or contract names the kings. Instead, what survives is a tapestry woven by writers who lived in a world where the monarchy had long since fallen, but where its memory could be reinterpreted as moral instruction, political justification, or national mythology. The types of sources for this era reflect this distance. At the foundation lies oral tradition, transmitted through priestly rituals, family legends, and the performative storytelling that shaped communal identity. The Romans themselves admitted this. The historian Varro, writing in the 1st century BC, notes that the earliest centuries were obscured by time, obscura vestutate, and both he and later authors recognized that early records, if they ever existed, had been lost, destroyed, or altered beyond use. There were, in theory, the Annales Maximi, the yearly lists kept by the Pontifex Maximus, but these were said to have been damaged in the Gallic sack of 390 BC and reconstructed afterwards, raising immediate questions about accuracy. In this mess, our best guides are historians from the late Republic and early Empire. Foremost among them stands Livy, whose Ab Urbe Condita offers the fullest surviving account of the monarchy. Livy writes during Augustus' reign, and though he claims merely to report what earlier annalists preserved, his work is shaped by a desire to find moral lessons in Rome's beginnings, directly connected to the rise of Augustus. When he recounts the virtues of Numa Pompilius, or the arrogance of Tarquinius Superbus, he is not just describing kings, he is examining the roots of Roman character and the dangers of autocracy in a period where Augustus himself was consolidating unprecedented authority. Livy's language reveals this tension. He openly warns the reader that certainty is impossible. These things, like all matters of such antiquity, are more fitted for embellishment than for proof. In that single line, he gestures both to the grandeur of the tradition and to its fragility. Alongside Livy, we can put Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek philosopher writing in the decades around 20 BC, whose Roman Antiquities covers the monarchy and early republic in lavish detail. Dionysius had its own motives. He believed deeply in the cultural kinship of Greeks and Romans and sought to show that Rome's early institutions, its law, its military practices, reflected Greek virtues. His kings, therefore, become exemplaries of Greek-style leadership. When Dionysius describes Romulus' creation of the Senate, or the census of Servius Tullius, he is often less interested in what happened than in how the Roman past could be made to fit a Hellenic framework. Other authors provide scattered glimpses. Cicero, though not a historian of the monarchy, references the kings in his philosophical and rhetorical works, often as symbols in moral arguments rather than as historical figures. Ovid, in the Fasti, embeds early Roman legends in the poetic calendar of the festivals, giving us a mythological understanding of religious institutions rather than a factual chronicle. Varro, whose antiquarian investigations lay behind many later accounts, survives mostly in fragments but remains essential for understanding the intellectual environment in which the monarchy was reconstructed. So as far as the kings of Rome, our pitfall is not having contemporary sources. Anachronism permeates the material. What we find in the writings is a Rome that only came later, a Rome of a developed Senate, of formalized voting assemblies, of detailed census categories. All of these came later, but was projected back to the kings. Perhaps the most revealing pitfall is ideological retrojection. Roman writers living under Augustus had a powerful incentive to create a past that justified monarchy restored as tradition. Augustus positioned himself not as king, rex remained a toxic word, but as a restorer of ancient customs. He took from the kings without being one. Livy's portrayal of the early kings as moral leaders whose downfall came from individual vice rather than from the structure of kingship himself fits neatly into Augustan ideology. Dionysius, meanwhile, emphasizes the constitutional and lawful nature of early monarchy, creating a model of ordered kingship that makes Augustus' position seem historically grounded. And with that, we move to the following era, the early and Middle Republic. This time inhabits a space between shadow and clarity. No longer the mythic haze of the kings, yet not yet the documentary richness of eyewitnesses of the late Republic. This is the era where Rome emerges as a regional power, fights the Latin states, Etruscans, Samnites, and Carthaginians, and shapes the political institutions that later writers treat as the backbone of Roman identity. Again, we find ourselves relying on almost the same historians we were talking about before, just a little bit closer. It's still second-hand accounts, working on reconstructed memory, shaped by annalists with political motives and curated by late Republican and Augustan intellectuals who use the past to argue about the present. But there are differences in respect to the kings. The type of sources that exist in this period represent the first real expansion of Roman historiography. The priestly Annales Maximi, theoretically the annal records of magistrates and major events kept by the Pontifex Maximus, provide one of the earliest backbones, now direct. But they were published only in the 2nd century BC, long after the periods they described, and even ancient critics were skeptical of their reliability. The Roman noble families also maintained family archives, designed not to tell the truth, but to glorify lineage. These eulogies, rewritten across generations, often exaggerated the deeds of ancestors or inflated their magistracies, and later historians leaned on them without always recognizing their distortions. But we can use them because, well, in order for the lie to work, there has to be enough truth not to make the lie obvious. So, as we said in various other videos about sources, in lies we can find truth just because they're being told to people who kinda know what it's being talked about. The antiquarian works of Cato the Elder, especially his Origines, represented the first attempt at a prose national history written by a Roman. But only fragments survive today, leaving us with tantalizing glimpses. Again, we find Livy, of course, we've already talked about him, but the most reliable surviving voice of the period is the Greek historian Polybius, writing in the mid-2nd century BC as a hostage living in Rome. His works cover the period of Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance, especially the Punic Wars. Polybius is closer to the events than Livy, and he explicitly chastises earlier historians for invention, moralizing, and lack of autopsy. His famous methodological claim is that a historian must investigate events personally, travel, interview participants, examine documents, and remove rhetorical embellishment. But Polybius is not free of bias. He is a friend of the Scipionic circle, the family from which Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal, comes from. His admiration for Rome's political system shapes his account. When he describes Fabius Maximus' cautious strategy against Hannibal, or Scipio Africanus' campaign in Spain and Africa, his narrative leans toward explaining Roman success as inevitable or rational. Even so, Polybius is invaluable not only for his relative proximity, but also for a present he made to all of us. He quoted treaties. Treaties such as the first treaty between Rome and Carthage, which provide the kind of documentary anchor otherwise missing. Cicero, again, in his philosophical and rhetorical writings, gives incidental insights into republican institutions, particularly the functioning of the Senate, magistracies, and the legal culture. But his aim was never documentary precision. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence begin to appear with greater frequency. The Fasti Capitolini, excavated in the Roman Forum, preserve consular lists that help calibrate chronology. Early Latin inscription and temple dedications provide concrete anchors for events and individuals. So we have the many historians from before and a new little pack. So what are the pitfalls of this era? They are both structural and ideological. Mainly, we see the beginning of senatorial family propaganda. Many early annalists, such as Valerius Amtias or Claudius Quadrigarius, wrote within a competitive aristocracy where amplifying the glory of one's ancestors was not merely permitted but expected. This created distortions, invented consulships, exaggerated victories, and inflated casualty numbers that later historians accepted or only partly corrected. Livy's frequent complaints about absurd figures are themselves part of the problem, and isn't it a very YouTube thing? Livy in the far, far past saying that those figures of that battle are completely nonsensical. You can see the video title. You won't believe what this historian has said. But moving on, we still have a problem with moralizing hindsight. The Romans of the late Republic and Augustan age loved to interpret political history through the lens of virtue and decline. Livy frames early conflicts, the plebeian struggle, wars against neighboring people, as lessons about discipline, courage, and civic harmony. Polybius, though more analytical, still frames the Roman constitution as a masterfully balanced system whose success was inevitable, downplaying moments of improvisation, contingency, or internal conflict. This gives the period a coherence that likely never was there. And it's something you can still find in the history books. Rome looks like itself all the time, from the beginning to the end. And well, it wasn't that easy. There is also obviously survival bias. We hear almost nothing from the Latin, Etruscan, Samnite, or Celtiberian perspective in their own words. The Roman narrative absorbs and reshapes them. The wars against the Samnite, so central to Roman rise, survives almost completely through Livy's Augustan lens, with the archaeological evidence contradicting or complicated details of Rome territorial expansion and military organization. Similarly, we have nothing about the Carthaginian accounts of the Punic Wars. Polybius describes some fragments and inscriptions from North Africa add material context, but Hannibal and Carthage exist largely as Roman constructions. Even the chronological framework is fragile. The Varronian chronology, still standard in many modern accounts, is questionable at best, with Polybius, for example, complaining about the confusion in Roman dates caused by earlier historians. And archaeology sometimes reveals layers that do not align neatly with the literary timelines. And so, finally, we get out of the second-hand account era and into the first-hand account one, the late Republic. To speak of the late Republic is to walk into the single best documented yet most treacherously constructed era of Roman history. The period from the Gracchi to Actium creates the illusion of perfect visibility. Names like Cicero, Caesar, Sallust, and Plutarch seem to speak directly to us with the intimacy of personal letters, courtroom speeches, and political polemic. But this is precisely the trap. More than any other segment of Roman history, the late Republic is narrated by its own protagonist, men writing not for posterity but for immediate political goals, personal vindication, or the moral instruction of their peers. We are reading performances, arguments, and propaganda. The more polished the Latin, the more careful we must be about what has been left unsaid. At the same time, this era benefits from a level of source diversity unmatched earlier. coins, inscriptions, political decrees, archaeological surveys of battlefields and colonies, and a polyphony of Greek and Roman writers all covering what was happening, creating intersections where contradictions reveal bias rather than obscurity. It is an extremely interpretable era, and there is a reason why we love to talk about it. On a literary level, the dominant voice of the period is Cicero, whose vast corpus, from letters to speeches to treatises to philosophical works, forms a diary of a political class under pressure. His private letters offer emotional immediacy unmatched in ancient historiography. His grief during the civil wars, his self-doubt, his shifting alliances, his fear of irrelevance, all appear with a nakedness that seems almost modern. But this intimacy is itself a negotiation. Cicero writes knowing that the letters will circulate, knowing that the speeches may be published in revised forms, knowing that his political career depends on being seen as the savior of the Republic, even as he consults with tyrants for personal safety. His omissions are as revealing as his confessions. He narrates his exile with selective memory. He amplifies the dangers of the Catiline conspiracy to magnify his own role as a defender of the state. He also alternates between Caesar and Pompey, calling one friend or threat depending on the month. To use Cicero as a pure witness is impossible. To treat him as a nervous barometer of senatorial anxieties is indispensable to understand the time. And then, of course, there's him, Julius Caesar, whose commentary on the Gallic and Civil Wars are masterpieces of political self-fashioning. He constructs himself as the embodiment of rational, measured authority, a commander forced into war by the perfidy of others, a strategist whose victories are the natural expressions of Roman superiority under his leadership. His prose is famously clear, and it is for a reason. It is a weapon. He speaks of himself in the third person to imply impartiality, omits his own provocations, downplays the scale of destruction in Gaul, and transforms his brutal campaigns into inevitabilities of frontier management. Archaeology in France and Belgium has repeatedly revealed a higher casualty rate than what is reported, heavier fortifications, and more chaotic battlefield dynamics than Caesar narrative allows. Yet the commentari remain foundational because they preserve logistical detail, troop movements, engineering feats, and they were read aloud in Rome while the campaigns were going, or right after. So Roman soldiers who were fighting there were listening to it. So the lies, as we said before, needed to be extremely measured. Then we have our darkest author, Sallust, who writes decades later but claims to diagnose the sickness of the Republic itself. His Bellum Catiline and Bellum Jugurthinum, alongside fragments of the Historiae, blend historical narrative with moral philosophy, presenting Rome as a state corrupted by greed. Yet, he himself was expelled from the Senate for, well, corruption. Then he was rehabilitated by Caesar, and it is Caesar's patronage that shaped both his judgment and his silences. When he says the Republic fell because its citizens abandoned virtue, he is not offering a neutral diagnosis, but a critique rooted in the political disappointments of his own career. Still, his sharp characterization, archival detail, and attention to social conflict makes him one of the essential windows into the anxieties of the late 1st century BC, even when the anxieties are, well, those of Sallust himself. And then comes him. It is obvious that I like this guy considering the nickname of my account and this entire channel, Plutarch. He was composing in the early 2nd century AD. His work gives us both the paired biographies of Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, Crassus and Cicero, Antony and Octavian. His portrayals are structured to explore moral character rather than political mechanics. emphasizing anecdotes, personal traits, and formative influences. Plutarch's reliability varies. Sometimes he preserves the precious fragments from lost writers. At other times he repeats dramatic stories that reflect moral imagination more than archival accuracy. His version of the late Republic is a tragedy of character, leaders undone by ambition, virtue, or excess. And while this deeply shapes the modern imagination, it must be handled with caution. But the benefit of Plutarch is that he looks for personality, where Roman writers often look for ideology. He restores the individual to a political age that Roman authors often moralize into abstractions. So to answer the inevitable question, why the Plutarchian? Well, I love Plutarch because while he might not be the most perfect historian, he understands the concept of a well-told story, and I do try to tell a good story. Sometimes a non-completely accurate story can propel truth into the millennia, as Plutarch did, considering how many had a Plutarch book under their arm, like Napoleon, George Washington, those who truly changed the world. Hovering above all these voices is Cassius Dio, whose massive Roman history, preserved in part, summarized in part, offers yet another angle. A senator writing under the Severian dynasty, retroactively interpreting the late Republic through the prism of imperial rule. Cassius Dio narrative of Caesar, Pompey, the conspirators, and the triumviral era carries the weight of hindsight. He knows what the end of the Republican institution looks like, and he reads their origin back into the century before. He brings sharp judgment, cold, institutional. He is less interested in character than in the mechanics of power, and he frequently corrects, challenges, or sidesteps earlier writers when his own political instincts sense distortion. The result is a history that sometimes is more perceptive but never free from the biases of elite political thinking under autocracy. Beyond the literary field, the late Republic provides a wealth of material evidence. Coins minted by Pompey, Caesar, Brutus, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian form a visual archive of competing legitimacies. Each coin advertises a version of the truth. Pompey presents himself as the conqueror of the sea, Caesar as the man favored by Venus, Brutus as the liberator striking down tyranny, Octavian as the youthful protector of the state. Inscriptions, fewer than the imperial period but still substantial, record provincial settlements, grant of citizenship, triumphal inscriptions, and legal reforms such as those enacted by Sulla and later by Caesar. Archaeology of battle sites like Alesia or Pharsalus sometimes confirm, sometimes correct the stories of the books. Colonial foundations in Spain, Gaul, and North Africa show how veterans were settled on land as political favors, confirming that structural pressures that writers like Sallust attribute to moral decline. Each piece of material evidence offers a check against the self-interested narratives of men who wrote to justify themselves. So to summarize a complex section, what are the pitfalls of the late Republic? We find the self-justification of politicians, the moralizing of annalists, the dramatic flair of biographers, the ideological simplification of later imperial writers, and still a lot of lost works. So the historian moves through the late Republic with both gratitude and suspicion, grateful for the density of the record, suspicious of his seductions. The era gives us more detail than we can sometimes handle, yet hides behind that detail the agendas of some of the antiquity most formidable writers. Next time, we will go into the sources of imperial Rome, and finally find a world where we cannot rely on Livy or our squad of historians that have dominated this section. I hope this wasn't too boring, and I'll see you soon for part 2. Have a good one.